Stop. Don't take him away. That's the man who saved my life. Claire Bennett's voice shattered the quiet ceremony like a stone breaking the surface of still water. More than 300 people turned at once. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to waiting lips. Even the wind seemed to hesitate as it swept across the memorial park overlooking Lake Evergreen. Two security officers paused beside an older black man standing near the back of the crowd. His coat was worn. His gray knit cap sat low over his forehead. His hands remained calm at his sides. He looked less like a threat and more like someone who had accidentally wandered into a place where he didn't belong. Yet moments earlier, several guests had complained about his presence. They assumed he was there for free food. They assumed he was lost. They assumed a lot of things. Claire stood from her chair so quickly it nearly tipped backward. Her white dress fluttered in the cool October breeze. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it inside her ears. 20 years. 20 years of searching. 20 years of wondering whether the stranger from that snowy night had even been real. And now, as the afternoon sunlight reflected off the memorial lake behind him, she couldn't stop staring. The crowd exchanged confused glances. Reporters lowered their cameras. A local news anchor blinked twice, unsure whether this was part of the program. The older man looked equally confused. His dark eyes met Claire's across the gathering. There was no recognition in them. Not yet. Claire swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled against the edge of the chair. The scar. It was the scar on his right hand that had stolen the air from her lungs. She had seen it from 30 feet away when one of the officers gently reached for his arm. A pale line stretching across weathered skin. A mark she remembered from a memory buried deep inside childhood. The memory came back in flashes. Snow falling sideways. A freezing wind screaming across the road. Warm hands lifting her from danger. A deep voice saying only 4 words. "You're safe now, kid." Claire had spent half her life wondering who that voice belonged to. The mayor stepped awkwardly toward the microphone. "Miss Bennett," he began, but Claire barely heard him. The ceremony around her faded into distant noise. Her eyes never left the stranger. The event was supposed to celebrate survival. It marked the 20th anniversary of the storm that changed her life forever. Every year, people gathered beside the lake to remember the rescue crews, volunteers, and families affected by the historic blizzard. But one name had always been missing. One face had never appeared in any photograph. One hero had vanished before anyone could thank him. Claire had built an entire foundation because of that mystery. Thousands of children had received scholarships through the Stranger Fund. Hundreds of families had received support. Every speech she gave ended the same way. "Someone saved me. Someone I never got to thank." The older man shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention now focused on him. He glanced toward the exit path as if considering whether he should simply leave. Claire's chest tightened. No, not again. She couldn't lose him again. Slowly, she stepped away from her chair. The heels of her shoes clicked softly against the stone walkway. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Guests parted instinctively as she moved through the crowd. The late afternoon sun hung low above the water, casting long golden reflections across the lake. Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she fought to keep her composure. 20 years of questions sat heavy in her chest. 20 years of searching newspaper archives, rescue reports, social media campaigns, interviews, podcasts, and public appeals. Nothing. Every lead disappeared. Every possibility faded. Yet something inside her knew. The same instinct she had carried since childhood was screaming now. The stranger lifted his head fully. For the first time, the sunlight touched his face. Claire stopped walking. Her breath caught. The crowd waited. The reporters waited. Even the security officers waited. And somewhere deep inside, a memory she had carried since she was 9 years old finally began to wake up. Claire stopped nearly 10 feet from the older man. The autumn breeze stirred fallen leaves across the stone walkway between them. Somewhere behind her, the lake water lapped gently against the shoreline. The sound was soft, rhythmic, almost comforting, but her pulse drowned out everything else. She stared at the stranger's face, searching for answers she had chased for most of her life. Up close, he looked older than she expected. Deep lines framed his eyes. Silver touched his beard. His coat had been repaired more than once, the stitching visible along one sleeve. Nothing about him suggested fame, recognition, or the kind of hero people built statues for. Yet something about his presence felt familiar in a way she could not explain. The security officers slowly stepped back after noticing the change in Claire's expression. The mayor lowered the microphone. Nobody seemed quite sure what to do next. Reporters exchanged glances, their cameras still rolling. Claire finally found her voice. "What is your name?" she asked softly. The man hesitated. His eyes moved briefly toward the crowd before returning to hers. "Marcus Reed," he replied. The name landed inside her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Marcus Reed. She had never heard it before. She had searched thousands of names over the years. None had led anywhere. Yet somehow hearing it now felt important. Real. Human. Not another dead and buried in old records. Marcus shifted his weight uneasily. "I did not mean to interrupt anything," he said. His voice was low and steady. "I saw the gathering from across the street. I just wanted to listen." Claire felt her throat tighten. The voice. Older now. Rougher. But there was something hidden beneath the years that stirred an old memory. She closed her eyes for a brief second. Snow. Wind. Darkness. A pair of strong hands wrapped around a frightened child. For simple words. "You are safe now, kid." When she opened her eyes again, the crowd had faded into the background. For a moment, it felt as if only the two of them existed beside the lake. "You were there," she whispered. Marcus frowned slightly. "I am sorry." Claire swallowed hard. 20 years ago, during the blizzard, the expression on Marcus's face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. A tiny shift in his eyes. A flicker of recognition. Then it disappeared. "A lot happened 20 years ago," he said quietly. Claire looked at his right hand again. The scar was unmistakable now. A pale line crossing dark skin. One she had described hundreds of times in interviews and podcasts. One detail she remembered despite forgetting almost everything else about that night. Her mother used to tell her the story every year on the anniversary. The little girl trapped in a vehicle. The whiteout conditions. Emergency crews struggling to reach stranded families. And the stranger who appeared before anyone else arrived. No name. No report. No reward. He simply disappeared after making sure she was safe. Claire spent years trying to understand why. When she was 12, she began collecting newspaper clippings. At 15, she started contacting retired first responders. At 19, she launched online searches. By 24, she had created a public campaign dedicated to finding him. Every effort ended the same way. Silence. Yet that silence changed her life. It pushed her towards service. It inspired the Scholarship Foundation. It became the reason she spent weekends mentoring children from struggling families. One unknown act of kindness had shaped everything that followed. The sun drifted lower over the lake. Golden light reflected across the water and illuminated Marcus's face. He looked away from the attention surrounding him, almost uncomfortable with it, almost as if he wished nobody had noticed him at all. Claire suddenly understood something that unsettled her. Heroes often imagine themselves as ordinary people. The truly extraordinary ones rarely realize the impact they left behind. Marcus glanced toward the memorial plaque near the shoreline. His eyes lingered there for a moment. Then he quietly asked, "The little girl from the storm? That was you?" Claire nodded. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, gentle and fragile. And for the first time in 20 years, the mystery that had lived in Claire Bennett's heart no longer felt like a story. It felt like a person standing right in front of her. The silence between them seemed to pull the entire crowd into its gravity. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound came from the wind sweeping across the lake and rustling through the rows of memorial flags planted along the shoreline. Claire studied Marcus carefully. She had imagined this moment hundreds of times over the years. Sometimes she pictured a retired firefighter. Sometimes a police officer. Sometimes a rescue worker whose name had simply been overlooked. Never once had she imagined a man standing alone in a faded coat, looking almost embarrassed by the attention. Marcus glanced toward the ground before lifting his eyes back to hers. "You grew up," he said softly. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. The words were simple, but they struck Claire harder than she expected. 20 years ago, she had been a frightened little girl wrapped in a blanket inside an emergency shelter. Now she was standing before him as a grown woman whose entire life had been shaped by a moment he barely seemed to remember. "Because of you," Claire replied. Marcus immediately shook his head. "No," he said. "Because of a lot of people. Your mother. Your teachers. The people who stayed beside you." Claire felt emotion rise in her chest. Even now, he was redirecting credit away from himself. The same humility she had heard described by countless people who devoted their lives to helping others. One of the reporters slowly stepped closer. "Mr. Reed," she called carefully, "is it true you were the man who rescued Claire Bennett during the Evergreen blizzard?" Marcus looked uncomfortable. His shoulders stiffened slightly. He glanced at the dozens of faces watching him. Then he gave a small shrug. "I helped a little girl," he answered. "That is all." A murmur swept through the crowd. The answer felt too small for something that had become almost legendary in the town. Claire remembered the stories. Every anniversary brought another article, another interview, another attempt to identify the mysterious stranger who appeared and disappeared during one of the worst winter storms in local history. Nobody had ever found him. Some people believed he had moved away. Others believed he had passed away years ago. A few even questioned whether the story was entirely true. Yet here he stood, real, quiet, ordinary. The mayor finally stepped forward. His expression carried both surprise and curiosity. "Mr. Reed," he said, extending a hand, "the entire community owes you gratitude." Marcus hesitated before politely shaking it. "That is kind of you," he replied. "But I do not think anyone owes me anything." Claire noticed something then. While the crowd focused on Marcus, he kept glancing toward the memorial plaque near the water. Not at the cameras, not at the reporters, at the plaque. His eyes lingered there repeatedly, almost as if he were searching for something. Claire followed his gaze. Hundreds of names were engraved into the polished stone. Volunteers, first responders, community members, people who had helped others survive the storm. Yet one name was missing. His. The realization settled heavily inside her. For 20 years, nobody had known who he was, which meant nobody had ever thanked him publicly. Nobody had ever invited him back. Nobody had ever asked what happened to him afterward. The thought made her heart ache. Claire stepped closer. "Why did you never come forward?" she asked gently. Marcus was quiet for several seconds. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the lake, illuminating the silver threads in his beard. He folded his hands together as though considering how much to say. Finally, he exhaled. "Because the story was never supposed to be about me." Claire stared at him. "But people searched for you." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know." "You knew?" Claire asked, surprised. "Sometimes I saw the articles," he admitted. "Sometimes I heard people talking." "Then why did you stay hidden?" Marcus looked toward the water again. His expression softened. There was no pride in his face. No mystery. Only a quiet sadness that Claire could not yet understand. "Some people spend their lives wanting to be remembered," he said. "I spent mine trying to keep moving forward." The answer lingered in the cool October air. Claire felt a chill despite the sunlight. Something in his voice told her there was more to the story. Much more. And as she watched Marcus Reed standing beside the lake, she realized that finding him had never been the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. The crowd slowly began to breathe again, but the atmosphere around the memorial had changed completely. What had started as a routine anniversary gathering now felt like something far more personal. Reporters lowered their microphones. Several guests wiped at their eyes. Others simply stood in silence, watching the unexpected reunion unfold beneath the golden light of late afternoon. Claire remained beside Marcus, afraid that if she stepped away for even a moment, he might disappear again. For 20 years he had existed only as a question. Now he stood within arm's reach, and yet she still felt as though she knew almost nothing about him. "Will you stay for a little while?" she asked. Marcus looked around at the crowd. His expression suggested he would rather be almost anywhere else. "I do not want to cause trouble," he replied. Claire laughed softly despite the emotion still sitting heavy in her chest. "You are the reason half these people are here today." Marcus lowered his gaze. "I doubt that." Before Claire could answer, an older woman approached from the crowd. She moved slowly, leaning lightly on a polished wooden cane. Her silver hair caught the sunlight as she stopped in front of Marcus. For a moment, she simply stared at him. Then her eyes widened. "Wait," she whispered. Marcus looked at her politely. "Ma'am." The woman's hand trembled slightly. "Evergreen Community Shelter," she said. "January of 2004. Marcus blinked. "Yes." The woman covered her mouth. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "You brought blankets." Marcus looked surprised. "I remember helping there." "Helping?" the woman repeated. "My husband and I were stranded for 3 days during that storm. We arrived freezing and terrified. You sat with our grandson for hours because he was scared. Marcus's face softened as though he were trying to recall a distant memory. I remember a little boy with a toy truck. The woman laughed through tears. That was him. Around them, more people began stepping closer. Another man raised his hand. You worked at the church kitchen afterward, did you not? Marcus turned. For a while. You packed food boxes every Saturday. A younger woman suddenly spoke from behind the reporters. Oh my goodness. Everyone looked toward her. She shook her head in disbelief. You helped my mother when our apartment flooded. Marcus looked genuinely confused now. I did. You carried groceries up 3 flights of stairs every week for nearly 6 months. Marcus smiled faintly. Your mother baked lemon pie. The woman laughed. She sure did. Claire watched the exchange unfold with growing astonishment. One person after another stepped forward. Not because Marcus was famous. Not because he was wealthy. Not because he held power. People remembered him because he had quietly shown up in their lives when they needed someone. The stories came from different years, different neighborhoods, different circumstances. Yet they all sounded remarkably similar. Marcus never stayed long enough to receive recognition. He never asked for anything. He simply helped and moved on. The realization settled over Claire like a warm blanket. She had spent 2 decades searching for the man who saved her life. But perhaps the real story was much bigger than a single rescue. Perhaps Marcus Reed had spent his entire life doing exactly what he had done for her, helping strangers and disappearing before anyone could thank him. The sun drifted lower behind the trees. Long shadows stretched across the memorial grounds. Claire noticed Marcus becoming increasingly uncomfortable as more attention focused on him. His fingers tightened around the edge of his coat pocket. His eyes searched for an escape route. Finally, he cleared his throat. I think people are giving me too much credit. Several guests immediately disagreed. A few laughed. Others shook their heads. Marcus looked almost helpless beneath the unexpected wave of gratitude. Then Claire noticed something unusual. Every time someone thanked him, he accepted it politely. But there was a sadness behind his smile. A heaviness that did not belong in a moment like this. She saw it again when the crowd began sharing stories. A distant look in his eyes. A quiet loneliness that seemed untouched by the celebration surrounding him. Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The more she watched him, the more convinced she became that there were years of untold chapters hidden behind that gentle smile. Years nobody in this town knew about. Years Marcus had carried entirely alone. And somehow she knew that whatever happened after the blizzard was the reason he had spent 2 decades avoiding the spotlight. The crowd remained gathered long after the official ceremony should have ended. Small groups formed across the memorial grounds, but nearly every conversation eventually drifted back toward Marcus. Claire noticed something remarkable. The more people spoke about him, the more uncomfortable he became. It was not false modesty. It was something deeper, almost as if he genuinely believed none of those stories mattered. The late afternoon air had grown cooler. A thin layer of golden sunlight stretched across the lake like liquid glass. Volunteers began folding chairs while reporters packed away equipment, yet very few people seemed ready to leave. Claire walked beside Marcus toward a quiet bench near the water. Fallen leaves crunched softly beneath their shoes. For the first time since recognizing him, they were alone. The noise of the crowd faded into the background. Marcus sat carefully on the edge of the bench. His hands rested together in his lap. Claire noticed how worn they looked. Calloused. Weathered. The hands of someone who had spent decades working hard without complaint. For a moment neither spoke. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable. Then Claire finally asked the question she had been carrying all afternoon. What happened after the storm? Marcus stared across the lake. His reflection shimmered faintly on the water. Life happened, he said with a small smile. Claire smiled back, but shook her head. That is not an answer. Marcus chuckled quietly. The sound carried a warmth that reminded her of an old family friend. No, I suppose it is not. He leaned back slightly and exhaled. The breeze tugged gently at the collar of his coat. I drove delivery trucks back then, he began. Nothing glamorous. Just long days and long roads. Claire listened carefully. After the storm, I went back to work. A few months later I moved south. My mother was sick. She needed help. Claire nodded. And after that, Marcus looked down at his hands. After that, I kept moving. The answer felt incomplete. Claire sensed it immediately. There were spaces between the words. Entire years hidden behind simple sentences. She had spent enough time interviewing people through her foundation to recognize when someone was protecting old memories. Before she could ask another question, a young voice interrupted them. Dad. Both turned. A man in his early 30s stood several feet away. He had Marcus's eyes, the same calm expression, the same gentle posture. He wore a dark jacket and carried a set of car keys in one hand. Marcus looked surprised. David. The younger man smiled. I got your message. Claire blinked. Message? Marcus stood. Claire, this is my son, David Reed. Claire immediately rose and shook his hand. David seemed equally surprised to find his father at the center of an emotional gathering. People have been posting pictures online all afternoon, he said. I saw your face everywhere. Marcus groaned softly. That sounds unfortunate. David laughed. You have no idea. Claire studied them together. Something felt strange. Not wrong. Just unexpected. David carried himself like someone who respected his father deeply, but there was also curiosity in his eyes. The kind of curiosity a person has when discovering something new. Did you know about any of this? Claire asked him. David looked at Marcus before answering. Not really. Claire frowned. You did not know he saved a little girl during the blizzard? David shook his head. No. Claire stared at Marcus in disbelief. You never told him? Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by her reaction. Why would I? David laughed softly. That is exactly what I said when I found out 2 hours ago. Claire could hardly believe what she was hearing. For 20 years, an entire community had searched for this man. She had built a foundation because of him, and his own son had never heard the story. David sat down beside his father. There is a lot Dad never talks about, he said. The words were lighthearted, but something in his tone caught Claire's attention. Marcus looked away toward the water again. David noticed. The smile faded slightly from his face. Especially the years before me. Claire felt her heartbeat slow. The atmosphere shifted. Subtly, quietly, like clouds moving across sunlight. She glanced from father to son. Marcus remained silent. David rubbed his hands together against the cool evening air. Then he said something that made Claire's stomach tighten. There was a long time when nobody knew where Dad was. Not even family. The lake breeze seemed colder now. Marcus lowered his eyes. And for the first time all day, Claire saw genuine pain pass across his face. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The sounds of the memorial faded behind them as the last of the guests drifted toward their cars. The sky above Lake Evergreen had turned a deeper shade of amber. Long shadows stretched across the shoreline, and the cool evening air carried the scent of water and fallen leaves. Claire sat quietly, sensing that whatever came next mattered far more than any story she had heard that afternoon. David looked at his father before speaking again. His voice was gentle, careful. I hope you do not mind me saying that. Marcus gave a small shake of his head. It is fine. Yet the sadness remained in his eyes. Claire noticed it immediately. The warmth that had appeared during the reunion seemed dimmer now, as though an old memory had quietly entered the conversation and settled beside them. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When I was growing up, there were years nobody really talked about, he said. My grandparents passed before I was old enough to ask questions. Most relatives lost touch. Every time I asked Dad about certain parts of his life, he would just smile and change the subject. Marcus sighed softly. Some stories are not very interesting. David laughed. That is not true, and you know it. Claire watched them carefully. The affection between father and son was obvious. So was the mystery. She had spent 20 years searching for Marcus, yet somehow his own family seemed to know only pieces of his journey. The realization felt strangely heartbreaking. How much of himself had this man hidden from the world? The lake reflected the fading sunlight like polished copper. A flock of birds crossed overhead, their silhouettes drifting against the evening sky. For a while, nobody spoke. Then Claire quietly asked, "Were you alone during those years?" Marcus remained silent long enough that she wondered if he would answer. Finally, he nodded. Mostly. The single word carried more weight than an entire explanation. Claire felt it immediately. Loneliness had a sound, a shape. Sometimes it lived inside simple answers. David stared toward the water. I found out some things after Mom passed, he said softly. Marcus lowered his eyes. David continued. Not much. Just pieces. The breeze lifted the edge of a memorial ribbon nearby. It fluttered gently against a post. Dad worked everywhere, David said. Construction sites. Delivery routes, church kitchens, community centers, temporary jobs, all over the country. Claire listened carefully. Why move so much? David looked at his father. Marcus smiled faintly. Sometimes life pushes people in different directions. Claire could tell he was simplifying again, protecting something. The pattern had become obvious. Every difficult chapter was reduced to a single sentence. Every sacrifice hidden behind a polite smile. Then David reached into his jacket pocket. I almost forgot. He pulled out a worn photograph. The edges were bent from age. I found this last year. Marcus immediately looked uncomfortable. David handed it to Claire. She studied the picture. It showed a younger Marcus standing beside a small community center. Several children surrounded him. Some smiled directly at the camera. Others looked distracted. One little girl held his hand. Claire stared at the image. The photograph radiated warmth. Simple happiness. Ordinary kindness. Where was this taken? She asked. Arkansas, David replied. 22 years ago. Claire looked at Marcus. You never mentioned any of this. Marcus shrugged. There is not much to mention. Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of the statement. Every new detail made him seem less ordinary and more extraordinary. Yet he remained completely unaware of it. David pointed toward the photo. The community center closed years ago, but I tracked down one of those kids. Claire looked up. You did? David nodded. She told me Dad paid for winter coats when the center ran out of funding. Marcus immediately shook his head. That was not a big deal. David smiled. To those kids, it was. Silence settled again. The sky had darkened further now. Lights from nearby streets reflected faintly across the lake. Claire stared at the old photograph resting in her hands. A strange feeling grew inside her chest. She had spent years believing Marcus saved her life during one snowstorm. But the evidence sitting in front of her suggested something much larger. He had been quietly showing up for people his entire life. And somehow, despite helping so many others, he had walked through much of his own journey unseen. The thought lingered heavily in her heart. Because for the first time, Claire began to wonder whether the person nobody remembered for 20 years was not the little girl he saved. It was Marcus himself. Darkness settled slowly over Lake Evergreen. The memorial grounds had almost emptied now. Most of the folding chairs were gone. The reporters had left. Only a handful of volunteers remained near the entrance, gathering banners and packing equipment into storage containers. Small lamps along the shoreline flickered to life one by one, casting warm reflections across the water. Claire sat quietly with the old photograph still resting in her hands. She could not stop looking at it. Every face in the picture seemed connected by something simple and rare. Trust. The little girl holding Marcus's hand smiled directly into the camera. Whoever she was, she had looked completely safe standing beside him. Claire understood that feeling. She remembered it even after 20 years. David broke the silence first. There is something else you should know. Marcus immediately looked up. David. His voice carried a gentle warning. David met his father's eyes. She deserves to know. Marcus stared toward the lake again. He did not argue. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken slightly. Whatever came next clearly mattered. David folded his hands together and took a slow breath. About 15 years ago, Dad disappeared again. Claire frowned. Disappeared? David nodded. For almost 3 years. The breeze stirred the leaves around their feet. Marcus remained motionless. David continued carefully. Nobody knew where he went. Family could not find him. Friends lost contact. Even I did not know much because I was still young. Claire looked at Marcus. Why? Marcus said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the water. David reached into his wallet and removed a folded newspaper clipping. The paper was old and yellowed. He handed it to Claire. She unfolded it carefully beneath the glow of a nearby lamp. Her eyes moved across the headline. Community volunteer leads recovery effort after historic flood. Beneath the headline was a photograph. Marcus, younger, standing beside dozens of volunteers in mud-covered boots. Claire looked closer. The article described weeks of recovery work following a devastating flood in another state. Food distribution, temporary housing, emergency supplies, community rebuilding. Marcus appeared throughout the article. His name was mentioned repeatedly. Claire looked up in surprise. You organized all of this. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. A lot of people helped. Claire almost laughed. Every answer sounded exactly the same. David smiled knowingly. Keep reading. Claire continued. Near the bottom of the article, one paragraph caught her attention. It mentioned that Marcus stepped down shortly afterward due to exhaustion and health concerns. The article ended there. Simple, brief, incomplete. Claire frowned. This does not explain anything. David nodded. That is because nobody knew the full story. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. The expression on his face carried years of quiet weariness. David. His voice was calm but tired. It is all right. David shook his head. No, it is not. For the first time all evening, emotion entered his voice. People deserve to know what happened. Claire sat perfectly still. The lamps reflected in the lake behind them. The water moved gently against the shoreline. Everything felt strangely quiet. David looked at her. During that flood response, Dad worked almost every day for months. He slept wherever he could. He gave away most of what he had. Eventually, he became sick. Marcus immediately waved a dismissive hand. It was nothing serious. David ignored him. He lost his apartment. Claire blinked. David continued. Then he lost his job. Then he lost contact with almost everyone. The words settled heavily into the cool night air. Claire stared at Marcus. He offered only a faint smile, as though they were discussing somebody else entirely. It happens, he said softly. Claire felt something tighten painfully inside her chest. 20 years. 20 years she had spent searching for the man who saved her life. 20 years of imagining him living some heroic story filled with recognition and gratitude. Instead, she was discovering something very different. A man who kept helping people even when life became difficult. A man who quietly disappeared rather than ask for help himself. Marcus looked toward the dark water. His reflection shimmered faintly beneath the shoreline lights. Then he spoke so quietly Claire almost missed it. The truth is, there were years when I did not think anyone remembered me at all. The words hung in the darkness. And for the first time since meeting him, Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes. Claire could no longer hold back the tears gathering in her eyes. They slipped silently down her cheeks as she looked at Marcus sitting beside the dark water. The man who had shaped her life without ever knowing it sat only a few feet away, speaking about years of loneliness as though they were nothing more than passing weather. The thought broke her heart. The lamps around the memorial cast warm circles of light across the shoreline. Reflections shimmered across the lake like scattered pieces of gold. For a long moment, nobody spoke. David stared at the ground. Marcus watched the water. Claire wiped her eyes and finally found her voice. You were wrong. Marcus turned toward her. About what? Claire took a slow breath. You said there were years when nobody remembered you. Marcus offered a small smile. That is just how it felt sometimes. Claire shook her head. No, you changed my entire life. The emotion in her voice surprised even her. I spent 20 years trying to find you. Every scholarship my foundation awarded happened because of you. Every child we helped happened because one stranger chose kindness during the worst day of my life. Marcus lowered his gaze. Claire continued. You thought nobody remembered. But hundreds of children exist in a better future because of something you did. Silence followed. The breeze moved gently through the trees above them. Somewhere across the lake, a bell rang from a distant church tower. The sound drifted softly across the water. David looked at his father. She is right. Marcus did not answer. Claire reached into her purse and removed her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. There is something I want to show you. Marcus looked uncertain. Claire opened the website for the Stranger Fund. The homepage appeared beneath the glow of the screen. Photographs filled the display. Children smiling at graduation ceremonies. Families gathered at community events. Scholarship recipients standing proudly beside college acceptance letters. Volunteer projects. Mentorship programs. Years of lives touched by a single act of kindness. Claire handed him the phone. Marcus stared quietly. His eyes moved from image to image. The lake reflected against the screen as he scrolled. All of this, he asked softly. Claire nodded. Because of you. Marcus swallowed. For the first time all evening, the calm expression he wore began to crack. David leaned closer and studied the photographs as well. Dad, he whispered. Marcus continued scrolling. One picture showed a young girl holding a scholarship certificate. Another showed a group of students standing beneath a banner that read "Futures begin here." Then he stopped. A photograph filled the screen. Hundreds of children gathered during a summer community event. Above them hung a simple sign. The Stranger Fund. Marcus stared at the image for several seconds. His hand trembled slightly. I never knew. His voice was barely audible. Claire smiled through tears. That is because you never stayed long enough to see what happened after you helped someone. The words settled gently between them. Marcus lowered the phone. His eyes glistened beneath the memorial lights. David placed a hand on his father's shoulder. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The truth was finally sitting in front of them. Marcus had spent years believing his acts of kindness disappeared the moment he walked away. Yet the evidence surrounded him now. Lives changed. Opportunities created. Generations touched. The ripple had never stopped spreading. Across the memorial grounds, a few remaining volunteers paused to look toward the bench. The evening had grown quiet. Peaceful. Almost sacred. Marcus took a long breath and looked out across the lake one more time. The dark water reflected the stars beginning to appear overhead. Then he whispered something so softly that only Claire and David could hear it. Maybe I should have stayed long enough to see the good that came afterward. Claire smiled and gently shook her head. No, Marcus. You stayed exactly long enough. The rest was our turn. The following morning arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. Sunlight spilled across Lake Evergreen, turning the water into a sheet of silver and gold. For the first time in years, Marcus Reed did not wake up feeling invisible. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. He stood near the shoreline before the town had fully awakened, hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching thin ribbons of mist drift across the water. The memorial grounds were quiet now. Empty chairs were gone. The banners had been packed away. Only the stone monument remained, standing peacefully beside the lake. Footsteps approached behind him. Marcus turned and found Claire walking toward him carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Her short hair moved gently in the morning breeze. She handed him one of the cups. I thought you might be here, she said. Marcus smiled. I could not sleep much. Neither could I. They stood side by side in comfortable silence. The warmth from the coffee drifted into the cool morning air. Across the lake, sunlight touched the tops of the trees, painting them in shades of amber and copper. After several moments, Claire reached into her bag and removed a small wooden box. Marcus looked at it curiously. What is that? Claire held it carefully in both hands. Something that should have happened a long time ago. Marcus frowned slightly. Claire opened the box. Inside rested a polished brass plaque no larger than a notebook. Simple, elegant, uncomplicated. Marcus lowered his eyes to read the inscription. His breath caught. The plaque contained only a name. Marcus Reed. Beneath it were a few simple words. Because one act of kindness can change generations. Marcus stared silently. The lake breeze moved softly around them. Somewhere in the distance, birds called from the trees. Claire continued speaking quietly. The board approved it this morning. Marcus looked up. Board. Claire smiled. The foundation board. He blinked. Claire. She gently shook her head. No speeches. No ceremonies. No giant statues. I know you would hate that. Marcus laughed softly despite the emotion rising in his chest. You know me surprisingly well for someone who spent 20 years looking for me. Claire smiled. I learned from the stories. She nodded toward the memorial grounds. The plaque will be placed beside the scholarship center next week. Marcus looked back at the inscription. For a moment he could not find words. Not because of pride. Not because of recognition. But because for the first time he understood something he had never allowed himself to see. The kindness he gave away had never disappeared. It had continued traveling long after he moved on. Through Claire. Through the children. Through every life that touched another life afterward. David arrived a few minutes later carrying breakfast sandwiches and his usual easy smile. Together they sat near the water as the town slowly came alive around them. They talked about ordinary things. Future plans. Family stories. Favorite meals. Small moments. The kind of conversation people share when they finally stop carrying old distances between them. Hours passed almost unnoticed. Eventually the sun climbed higher into the sky. The lake sparkled. Beneath the morning light, families began arriving at nearby parks. Children laughed somewhere beyond the trees. Marcus listened to the sound and smiled. Claire watched him quietly. 20 years ago, a frightened little girl had met a stranger during the worst day of her life. She remembered almost nothing from that day except a pair of steady hands and 4 simple words. You are safe now, kid. She finally understood why those words stayed with her for so long. They were not just comfort. They were a promise. A promise carried forward through decades of kindness. Marcus stood and looked across the water one last time. The wind brushed gently across the lake, creating small ripples that spread outward in every direction. Neither Claire nor David spoke. There was nothing left to say. Some stories ended with applause. Some ended with recognition. This one ended with something quieter. 3 people standing beside a lake beneath a clear autumn sky. Warm sunlight on their faces. A gentle breeze moving through the trees. And the peaceful certainty that kindness never truly disappears. It simply keeps moving forward, touching lives far beyond what anyone can see.